Hi there. My name is Rick Simmons, and I'm the digital editor at Bay Nature magazine. Welcome to Bay Nature Talks. I'm really excited to be joined tonight by Lou Stringer, the Associate Director of Natural Resources at the Presidio Trust in San Francisco. Lou's been working as an ecologist for 20 years, first with the National Park Service, now for the last 10 years with the Presidio Trust. He's got some amazing restoration work to talk to us about tonight. Hi, Lou.
Hi. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So we're going to go over some logistics first. This will be about a 30-minute talk. Lou will be showing some of his really incredible before and after pictures. Afterward, we should have about 15 or 20 minutes to answer questions. So if you have a question at any time during the talk, please use the Zoom Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to type it in. We'll collect them as we go. So we do have a lot of people here, but we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. And please do note, we are not able to help with technical questions while we're talking. So if you have a technical Zoom Q&A question, we can't get to it, but we will record the webinar and email a link afterward. So if you're having any technical issues, you will be able to see this later. Finally, for those who haven't seen it, Bay Nature Magazine is a nonprofit magazine and website. You can help us keep writing and reporting on the natural world by subscribing or donating at baynature.org. We thank especially those who made the suggested donation for this event tonight. Support lets us bring you these talks. Okay, let's talk about how to bring back a long-buried watershed. So part of my job, of course, is to read the news about nature. And I have to admit that can be kind of a grim thing to do. The world is overflowing with stories of extinction, habitat destruction, climate chaos. There's a lot of days where it feels pretty overwhelming and helpless, especially right now. So it's with real appreciation that I introduced the subject tonight of what seems like a turnaround in the other direction. Lou is going to talk to us about a journey that started decades ago, and it's just scheduled to reach an end in the coming months. So 25 years ago, the United States Army turned the Presidio of San Francisco over to the National Park Service. It had been an Army base for 200 years, dating back to the arrival of the Spanish in San Francisco. And soon after the transfer in 1996, Congress created the Presidio Trust to manage much of the park and its natural resources. And the Park Service and the Trust decided to make this former Army base a park that emphasized nature. The opportunity facing the ecologists at the Presidio Trust. They had land, a lot of land in an urban area. Who gets land in San Francisco? But it was developed, buried, and fundamentally changed by 2 centuries of military use. So where to begin? What to do? How to do it? What does it even really mean to restore a place that has been so fundamentally transformed? This wasn't just a challenging undertaking, but one with few parallels. This watershed that we'll talk about tonight covers 270 acres in one of the most dense cities in the country, representing a range of former habitats: chaparral, creek, freshwater wetlands, saltwater wetlands, but also a grazing ground, a barracks, a parade ground, housing, dams, culverts, a highway. The Trust has been working on this project for nearly 20 years now, and they are very near the end. So I'm going to turn it over to Lou, and he's going to walk us through sort of what they did and why and how they did it. All right, Lou, take it away.
Thanks, Eric. And I just want to thank you guys for having me and being able to showcase the work we're doing. And I just want to give a shout out to what an incredible resource Bay Nature is for all of us, and the work you guys do is really a treasure. So thank you for sharing all these stories, and I'm very happy to share mine today. So let me switch over to the, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to give you a bit of a view of what we've been doing for a while. So for those of you who don't know, a lot of you probably do, but the Presidio is about a 1,400 acre national park within the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. It is, as Eric said, a relatively new addition to the Golden Gate National Recreation Area from 1994, when it became a national park from a former military base. Let's see if I can advance my slides here. Oops. There we go. Little context of where we are. It's always good to zoom out and see the big picture. So here's a view of the Tennessee Hollow watershed, and we're looking from the west to downtown. You can see Mount Diablo in the distance, Crissy Field over here to the left, And the Tennessee Hollow watershed is the biggest watershed in the Presidio. It's about 270 acres. It's about a fifth of the land of the Presidio. And it has several tributaries that are spring fed that then ultimately lead downstream to the bay. And it's seasonal creeks and then as perennial creeks as you get closer. And these different tributaries are like, I consider them kind of a string of pearls that we're slowly putting back together, one section at a time, 3 acres here, 3 acres there. So we're gonna talk about the history of this landscape and the work that we've been doing to restore it. The Tennessee Hollow is named after the 1st Tennessee Regiment that was a volunteer group of soldiers that came through the Presidio on their way to fight in the Spanish-American War in the Philippines. And they were stationed here in around 1898. And here are their tents. And the Tennessee Hollow watershed had been rapidly transformed from the time of the gold rush until this period. But that's why it's called that, for the military history and that group of volunteers that shipped off soon after to fight in the Philippines. So let's back up a little bit and give a little context about what this place used to be like before even Europeans arrived. This is perhaps the first known illustration, firsthand account of the landscape of San Francisco. It was painted by a gentleman named Louis Choris in 1816. And Louis Choris was the ship's artist on the Rurik expedition that was a circumpolar ship. You can see it down in the corner here. There's the Rurik being looked at it right at the base of the Golden Gate. But note the landscape that they found here in the Presidio that at this point had already been transformed by almost 50 years of Spanish settlement, and thus the El Presidio that you see here. You can see, if you look closely, cattle, you can see horses in the picture. But notice it's almost a treeless environment, save for the hills that are topped with coast live oaks. It was a dunescape, a grassland, oak woodland, but none of the trees that we find today, the eucalyptus and pines. So it gives a real good insight into what this landscape used to look like. Of course, before the Spanish were here, the Yalama Ohlone were the people that tended this land for thousands of years, that lived right here in the Presidio and in San Francisco and harvested shellfish, attended the wildlands and the bulb fields of the serpentine grasslands. And this was a group of people that migrated from various place to various place within San Francisco, living close to the land, integrating, as we know all California Indians did, using fire, harvesting acorns, harvesting mussels and oysters from the waters. By 1776, the Anza expedition had reached the edge of the Golden Gate, as this depiction, recreation of their journey did, and thus the transformation from the old to the new world would begin with the establishment of El Presidio in 1776 here in the lands that were the farthest reaches of the Mexican Empire going north. And here's a little bit of a different perspective on this landscape. If you know what we're looking at, you can kind of see some of the features of today's landscape. You can see Alcatraz out in the distance. This is a great historic photograph taken from Carlton Watkins looking out over the former marsh of what is now Crissy Field that used to stretch from Fort Point all the way through the Marina Safeway, and the great grasslands that cascaded down to that marsh plain as it existed in 1876. This was our first centennial, and thousands of people came out to look at a sham battle from 1876 of being invaded and seeing how the military responded. You can see the sinewing channel of the former marsh that was at Crissy Field. Well, we all know the Presidio has passed from post to park, as it happened with the great foresight of Phil Burton, and who enabled the legislation in 1872. And basically, they anticipated that the Presidio would eventually close and would have to have something happen with it. And so that was written into legislation in 1872. And by 1994, a younger Nancy Pelosi can be seen standing over Bill Clinton as he signed the bipartisan legislation creating the Presidio Trust. And for those of you who don't know, the National Park Service first inherited the Presidio, but it soon became clear that the cost of doing what was needed to be done in the historic buildings, et cetera, needed a whole new idea. And there was a lot of opposition, and there was, as we probably all remember, threats to sell the Presidio off. So the Presidio Trust was the brainchild of Nancy Pelosi, and born as an opportunity to create a new form of government, and that's who I work for today, is the Presidio Trust. And it was our mandate to take the appropriations from the federal government, invest them in the buildings that had been left behind, and then start to rent them out so that we could be self-sufficient by the year 2013. And that's exactly what has happened. This is what it looked like when we inherited the Presidio from the Army. It was basically known that they'd be leaving, and that they decided why spend the money on something that they knew they were going to get out of. And so we had former buildings and lots of graffiti and a huge system of old Army landfills that would ultimately cost $100 million to clean up throughout the Presidio. Pictures of Mountain Lake, degraded landscape that had been pumped to near oblivion, and a historic forest, which is a contributing feature of our National Historic Landmark, of which the Presidio is, that was overstocked and choked with invasive species that needed a lot of attention. So when the Presidio moved from post to park in 1994, the first project that was envisioned to really transform this place from a park, from an Army base to a post, was this rubble landscape at what is now Crissy Field, as it looked like in 1997. It was a brown field that the Army had obviously filled the marsh in to create the Panama Pacific exhibition in 1914. And you've probably seen pictures of this landscape as it looked. At the time, I first started my career working for the Golden Gate National Parks Association at the time, now they're Conservancy, and they raised over $34 million as a philanthropic agency to bring in money to help grow Crissy Field and to transform this incredible waterfront into a park for everyone, including the wildlife and the wildlands that would soon come to be. And that was an extraordinary time for me to be working here and to learning about the whole movement that is community-based restoration in San Francisco and across the world. And as this is how what we know that landscape to now be. It's about 16 acres of tidal marsh, fringing dunes, and a big airfield that recycled all of our concrete from the former landscape that was there. Another perspective on it. The restored landscape and the insert of Dwight D. Eisenhower as he was reviewing the troops in 1941 in this exact location. And it just shows the incredible changes that have happened in the Bay Area as well as in our landscapes. Well, what to do? The incredible leadership of people like Sharon Farrell, the opportunity was seized to create an amazing program to help engage the public and to bring the minds together of what can we do? This is an extraordinary opportunity. It's an extraordinary landscape, still full of remnant habitats that were hanging on in spite of all those years of disturbance. The Presidio Park Stewards was born in 1996 as a community-based restoration program, mostly first with the National Park Service, then with the National Parks Conservancy, and now with the Presidio Trust. So we're a tri-agency partnership that was started back in the day that really came together as a unique group of people that came to come together to figure out what could be done and how to restore this incredible place. all those wildlands that were still here, we started to collect the seeds from them, built a native plant nursery, and started the process of removing invasive species and restoring the acre by acre the many incredible habitats that were here. I would be remiss without pointing out that none of this could happen without the extraordinary planning efforts that our planners put in and the foresight to imagine in a long-term process what this place could be, and the vision and the roadmap that was created from multiple documents and planning processes that happened through the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, the Presidio Trust Management Plan, and later the Tennessee Hollow Watershed Environmental Assessment. And if you read these documents, there's a lot of inspiration in there, as well as just how are we going to do this? It envisioned 50 years of work that would transform these places from the derelicts, overgrown spots that they were to the vital places that we hoped they would be. And these visions were an important part of convincing the public. This is basically our agreement with everybody in the Bay Area of how we were going to do it. And this gave us basically the authority to move forward, and it's basically our public trust to put out the vision for what this would be. So Crissy Field was our first project that happened as part of that restoration, and then the Presidio Trust was created, the organization I work for now, and we moved further up creek. So these little pearls that are getting strung back together through the urban landscape. Thompson Reach was a former Army landfill, another one that had the creek that we actually have decided to now call and rename after an old Ohlone village. We have the Tennessee Hollow Watershed, and the creek that flows through there, we have renamed Petlanook for the name of the village that was formerly at the edge of the shoreline at Crissy Field. So I may be talking about Tennessee Hollow and the Petlanook Creek as we walk through this, but you can see the daylighting of Petlanook Creek of the Tennessee Hollow Watershed here in 2004 as we're removing a contaminated Army landfill. So just to give you a little perspective of where we are, Crissy Field at the north, and a lot of urban infrastructure in between. That little red area is the 3-acre spot that is now known as Tennessee Hollow. Of Thompson Reach. Like all of the work that we've done from the beginning of the Presidio Park Stewards program, it's been an effort to not only bring back these wild places, but to bring people along all the way. We couldn't do this without bringing a sense of cultural impetus to this. And we have been blessed since the beginning with thousands of people that have come out to help us collect seeds, grow plants, and bring them back and into the landscape. And we are blessed with one of the largest volunteer groups in the entire national park system. So just give you a little sense of the transformation of this project. Here we are at Thompson Reach in 2003. This is the kind of landscapes that we found all over the place. This is a landfill, basically brownfield with a lot of invasive vegetation. And as we move through this, you can kind of see the transformation. Here we are in 2004 as the landfill is being removed, the creek is being daylighted. Lots of willows were used to stabilize the banks in this particular location. And now, several years later, 2005, you can see them growing up. And the vegetation is filling in with over 80 species of native plants that were grown until it looks like this. It's like it was always there. It's hard to remember that these places were anything but what they are once you start this process.
Lou, can I stop you there and ask if that's
Sure.
what it was meant to look like? Did you know it was going to look like that? How much was there room for this to sort of take its own course?
So that's a great question, and so much of the Tennessee Hollow Watershed is a jigsaw puzzle of fitting it between a road and a fiber optic line that ultimately runs to China that you can't disturb. And so that creek that you saw a little further back, we knew that was going to be there. We wanted that daylighted, but we also realized that we couldn't allow for it to meander the way a natural creek would do, because if it did, it might bump into a hardscape that we needed to preserve there. So we use natural engineering in the form of willow walls and wattles to kind of anchor that in place, but would also provide habitat. And then we added the addition of all of the other species, the wax myrtles, the toyons, all of the sedges and rushes that are a part of this landscape now. And we thought it would look something like this. In fact, we often do a lot of renderings that envision these landscapes, and it kind of looks like what we expected. Now, the question is, would it have looked like this pre-European? And that we don't really know. And in fact, I doubt it. A lot of these landscapes are so dense with native plantings and diversity that they might not have looked like this, but they're assemblages of the species that we knew were here based on the historic records of the people that first found them here and the botanists that came along. So that's kind of the context. Okay, so part of the program that I have been working with for 20 years is to really document these changes, not only to implement them, to get people along, but to bring science with us, to really showcase and to track through monitoring, how are we doing? Is this actually working in the ways that we hoped it would? And so what you're looking at here is a graphic with one of our partners, Point Blue Conservation Science, that we've been working with for years, that they help us monitor the changes in the bird community as time goes on. And these particular species that you're seeing here, the Anna's hummingbird or the song sparrow, these are species that rely on the kind of habitat that we created in this particular location. And so we are very excited to see that their abundance has gone up dramatically from the beginning, from 2003 when this wasn't here, until they are. So we do a lot of this as we do the restoration. We're tracking the changes with monitoring and as much science as we can do. So let me stick back. We'll go to the headwaters of the watershed where the springs come out of the water. And the most famous one, I think I've spelled that wrong up there, SPRNING, POLIN Spring, that should be. As you can see, we're at the south part of the Presidio here. And POLIN Spring was a famous place. It was kind of mythologized by the Army as a place where the waters came out and allowed for great fertility. And there's some great stories that the Spanish had invented that go along with that are a little bit racy. I'm not sure I'll tell you about them, but this is what it looked like in the 1950s after a lot of WPA work had come in. All this stonework that you find around the Presidio was done at that time. And POLIN Spring was also home to the famous Juana Briones, a famous Californian who basically created her home here. She was married to a drunken Spanish soldier at El Presidio who was, by all accounts, abusive and not there. But this is the excavation of a foundation of Juana Briones' house that was right next to what we now call Petalinook Creek that bubbles out of the ground at POLIN Springs. And she was a mystic, a healer, an entrepreneur, a doctor, and an extraordinary person who raised I think she raised about 11 children in this very small hut at the banks of POLIN Springs, and later became a cattle rancher and a big land baron in much of California and the Bay Area. Here's the beginnings of the restoration. If you look in the distance, you can see a large stand of blue gum eucalyptus that had expanded from the historic plantings that the Army had done. And here we are beginning the process of transforming POLIN. That black plastic was a technique that we continue to use this day to flush and then kill a lot of the invasive species before we come back and replant them, so we have a clean palette to start with. Notice in the pictures ahead, you won't see those blue gum eucalyptus in the horizon anymore. This picture shows the project as it proceeded around 2009 to 2012, We removed landfills, removed about 3 acres and about 100 blue gum eucalyptus from the further reaches of the watershed. And that's a thriving riparian area that is one of the hot spots for birders throughout San Francisco and the Bay Area. It is one of the great locations to come and see migratory birds such as the Allen's hummingbird that are, drinking from the springs at POLIN itself. So jumping down creek, here we go, 2014. YMCA Reach, this is a picture of an area that we call the Dust Bowl. It was, again, the creek put into a pipe, buried and left for dead, and then paved over and became a place for many years as we were doing our work. It was the laydown area for all of the excavation work and earth moving. And it often the winds would pop through and it would create these dust clouds. And so it was known as the Dust Bowl. Here it is, just upstream of that former Thompson Reach and obviously upstream of Crissy Field, another 3-acre site. And throughout this process, we've engaged volunteers, and you can kind of see the beginnings of the waters coming back to the surface, all of the sedges and rushes, and the over 100 plants that are native to the Presidio being outplanted in here. And here's just a perspective of what it looked like in 2014 as those waters kind of came through the 750 feet of new channel that are pinned in with pinning logs and rock revetments to hold it all in place. And if you go out there today, I was out there yesterday for a few minutes, and it's just a bonanza of colors and flowers, late seasoning, asters blooming, goldfinches feeding off of all of the plants that are there now, and it's still growing in. So it is a vital place. It is a place that brings spirit back to this place. And one of the great things that I think I can say about all of the work that we do here is that, similar to the feeling that a lot of us get when we go to a national park and get into wilderness area, all of us who have been involved in this work and who participate in going back and making sure invasives aren't there or just seeing how things are progressing, it gives you that same feeling of renewal that you get when you're in a wild place. And so it's an extraordinary opportunity to provide that sense of wilderness within a city. And I get that every day, and I'm pretty privileged when I'm able to get out there and look at it. Yet another site in this Tennessee Hollow watershed that we began in 2015, MACARTHUR Meadow. This is a giant planting day. Every year we try to have about 100 people come out in our first plantings of the year and help us put these plants in the ground. MACARTHUR Meadow is an interesting site in that it's a very unusual spot geologically in that the bedrock sits particularly high in that location, and it allows for a perched water table. This area had been the spot where the Tennessee Regiment had actually camped, and it was so wet that they started realize that this wasn't going to work for them, and they started filling it in. And so 6 feet of fill had been put on top of this location that we ultimately removed and allowed for that water to come back. And what it did is it created an opportunity to create a kind of habitat that's been lost from the rest of San Francisco. With that high perched water table, we could create a kind of wetland called a wet meadow habitat. And in that habitat is a species that was first discovered from science right here in the Presidio that is now critically endangered. There are only 9 individuals left in the world. It's extinct from San Francisco, although we have been bringing it back to this site and others over the last several years. It's called Marsh sandwort, and it is a plant, like I said, was first discovered to science on the fringing freshwater wetlands that were seasonal to the edge of Crissy Field salt marsh. And it's a beautiful plant that once extended from Baja all the way up to Washington State, but it now only exists in one spot left in California at the Oso Flaco Dunes in San Luis Obispo. And it is a really extraordinary story of the kinds of work that we hope to do. is even though we're not in Yosemite or we're not in the Great Sierras or some of the bigger wildlands, we still have incredible conservation opportunities within the confines of a place like the Presidio. We have 6 endangered species of plants, that some of which only live here, and the marsh sandwort is a new one that we've reintroduced and are hoping to bring back into this kind of habitat that is otherwise unavailable and lost. So I'm going to kind of
do anything. Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah, sure.
Did you have to do anything to manage the water coming down? And how was that needed to be? Did you do this sequentially with El POLIN and then the wet meadows?
Yes. So a lot of the work, you know, if you go back to those early planning documents that envisioned doing all of these projects, it didn't anticipate doing them in any particular sequence. And so we did them opportunistically. And I failed to mention this, is that a lot of this work has been funded by either philanthropy from the generous donations of people like the Haas family that donated the majority of the work for restoring Crissy Field. But we also got money from the San Francisco airport, who had to fill some, you could call them wetlands. They are jurisdictional wetlands of these old rumble strips. If you've ever flown out of San Francisco, you'll see these ditches that were jurisdictional wetlands. And they had to fill some of those in to create some emergency rumble strips in case planes had to stop abruptly before they took off or they landed. And as a result of that, through the Clean Water Act, they had to mitigate the loss of those wetlands, and they gave us $7 million to assist us in our project to restore 3 of those wetland projects: the MACARTHUR Meadow, YMCA Reach, and now this next project that is under construction right now, QUARTERMASTER Reach. So in answer to your question, it was more opportunistic. We didn't have the funds available, and when they did become available, we started and moved ahead with those projects. So that's kind of the sequencing. And that's still the case today. Believe it or not, we've done the bulk of the work, but we still have about 50 acres to go out of the 100 acres that we've designated in the Tennessee Hollow watershed that we will do habitat restoration in. So here we are at QUARTERMASTER Reach, and so you can see this rendering of the future of what this area is about to look like. Here's the Golden Gate Bridge, and you can see out over here Crissy Field Lagoon as it is in the bay beyond. And what you're looking at right now is our vision in the form of a rendering of what we hope the next 5 years will help this landscape transform into. It is through these box culverts that you see here that connect what will be the saltwater tides that connect through San Francisco Bay into Crissy Field Lagoon, and will soon be in this newly excavated QUARTERMASTER Reach, which is right under the highway, and that I'll show you some photographs of in a second. But we are creating 6 new acres of tidal wetland as we speak right now. This just gives another step back to give you a little bit more context about what used to be here and what how it overlays with today. And so you can see the sinuing channel of the former marshlands. Here we are, Golden Gate Bridge out here by Fort Point. Over here, I don't know if you, Eric, are you seeing my cursor? These are, this was a really cool place over in the west part of this area that was a seasonal wetland. And if you look on old Spanish maps, it was called Pozo de los Marinos on the Spanish maps. And that was the place that was marked so that people, when the Spanish were coming in, could get fresh water for drinking. And those freshwater seasonal wetlands then bled into the tidal marshes that extended all the way from basically Fort Point all the way through to the marina, where the Marina Safeway is. And this big lobe right here was a big barrier beach of sand that was later known as Strawberry Island. And note out here, Black Point, this is where Fort Mason is today. And all of this is fill there was a big kind of basin right there that is now filled in. And this is the 1869 Coast Geodetic Survey. And you can see the original El Presidio as it existed back in 1869. Here it is colored in with that, the green would have been the salt marsh area. The sand is that tidal, the barrier beach, and the brown is the upland area. So I'm just going to give you a perspective to overlay this on the air photo that was just taken around 1990. You can see right here is the Palace of Fine Arts left over from the Panama Pacific exhibition of 1916. You can see the old Doyle Drive corridor that runs through here on the way to Golden Gate Bridge. And you can see the brown field that was Crissy Field prior to the Help Grow Crissy Field campaign and the restoration of that whole area. So I'm just going to flash this back and forth. And these are geo-referenced. So what you're seeing is the exact, or very close area that the former marsh and barrier beaches existed on in the now urban landscape of San Francisco. And so notice the biggest portion of the salt marsh and the open waters was buried significantly under fill, and extended all the way meandering through where the Palace of Fine Arts now into the district, into the Marina District. And this is just yet another perspective on this same landscape, looking from Fort Point, that area known as Black Point, not Fort Point, excuse me, Fort Mason. And you can see this landscape of San Francisco was full of these kind of wetlands, these seasonal dune slacks and ponds. This is an area known as Washerwoman Lagoon. These seasonal wetlands fringed the edges of the coast. And you can see the former salt marsh here at high tide and the big barrier beach looking out towards the Golden Gate here. This is Strawberry Island as it existed in approximately 1890. Also, this was just as an aside, the Tennessee Hollow watershed itself doesn't have that much in the way of sand dunes, but you can see the sand dunes that were once extensive, that stretch from Ocean Beach all the way down to where downtown is today. There's just little remnants of those left in San Francisco, and mostly they're in the Presidio on the fringing areas at Crissy Field. So here we are about a month ago, digging the excavation pit for the new expansion of salt marsh, the 6 acres at Quartermaster Reach. And you can see all the lenses of time that the history of geology tells us about the story of San Francisco. And that is the story of filling all of the fringes and edges of these former wetlands with fill and sand that was hydraulically pumped in. And you can really see that very clearly in this profile of these bay muds that are very distinctly observable right down below. And this layer of sand and fill that was pumped in to basically create the ground on which we built the Marina District and the edge of the Presidio at Crissy Field. So part of the work that we're trying to do is to get this right, that the elevations are correct, that we have the right soils so that the salt marsh species can thrive in there. And that's a lot of investigation that goes into making sure that we get that right. So just a big picture perspective of this, and then I'm going to tell one more story about what we're hoping to do in this project, and then we'll talk a little Q&A if we still have time. Are we doing all right on time, Eric? We're doing okay.
Doing just fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. So here you see, here's the new Presidio Parkway, formerly known as the Doyle Drive, that was taken down as part of the stimulus money in the Obama years to rebuild what was considered the third most dangerous highway in America. It was rebuilt, as we all know, if you're driving through here, and now we see what will soon be the marsh that extends right under this new tunnels project with the new Presidio Parkway extending. This is yet another rendering. And over here, another project I haven't mentioned, which is a huge another project, and I haven't really talked about it. And We are also on top of these tunnels to the west here and over here, involved in the Presidio Tunnel Tops project, which is about 14 acres, a new Dolores Park-sized park that will connect the main post of the Presidio all the way to Crissy Field with an assemblage of gardens and paths and picnic areas that are right adjacent to this salt marsh restoration that we are currently under construction with. And so one of the really cool opportunities that I have seized on with this project that we didn't consider when we were doing Crissy Field years ago was the opportunity to jump into some of the work that's been happening in the East Coast and certainly here with the Living Shorelines projects that have been happening throughout San Francisco Bay, to bring back Olympia oysters, the native Olympia oysters that were known to be here. We're not sure how abundantly they were here, but we think they were quite abundant. And we know that there were huge shellfish operations operating in Millbrae and reefs of oyster beds, like we found on the areas in the North Bay and in the South Bay. So oysters were certainly a big part of the community in San Francisco Bay, and have, we presume, been lost for a variety of reasons, whether it was hydraulic mining in the Gold Rush area and the filling of wetlands around the fringes of the bay. So as part of what we talk about in these kind of 21st century conservation efforts, we aren't necessarily attempting to go back to the habitats that used to be, but to use the organisms in new ways to integrate with the urban landscape that is today. And that's the kind of the story I want to tell you about right now. And we are working in a lot of innovative ways to see if we can bring oysters back, which are a fundamental species for building habitat within tidal systems, into this hardscape and into the Quartermaster Reach restoration. So here in the culverts that you're seeing that are now in, and they're connecting the waters, or will connect the waters from Quartermaster Reach to Crissy Field, we built into these basically what are otherwise flat, concrete areas, lots of interesting features that will help to grow life into them, including oysters and other beneficial invertebrate species that are part of San Francisco Bay. So instead of just building these culverts to be flat, lifeless conduits for water, we designed them in order to have lots of ridges and nooks that would enable things like oysters to fasten onto the hard spaces and grow into these places. And oysters, if you don't know, are basically, they build ecosystems. They attract all sorts of biodiversity. They filter water. They provide opportunities for fish to feed and other organisms to grow on them. So they're in many ways a keystone species. And if we can figure out how to integrate them into this hardscape and in this project, we have an incredible opportunity to learn some important things before the billions of dollars that we're about to spend on transforming the shoreline of the seawall and the rest of San Francisco to upgrade it for climate change. And that's what we're trying to do. And we're experimenting with all sorts of things, including the construction of these oyster balls that are made of concrete, sand, and shell. We harvested shell from many Bay Area restaurants for several years, brought them back to the Presidio, and have integrated them into the building of these oyster balls. And we're working with a really cool group at the California College of the Arts called the Ecological Architects Group, that's working with novel materials like fiberglass, as you see here, that's embedded with shell. And these are printed, 3D printed panels that we can insert within the culverts to help grow this kind of benthic organisms that we really hope, including oysters. And you can see examples of this we put some of these things out in the bay on buoys within Crissy Field, and we're astonished to see how many oysters had colonized them. And the oysters just swim along. They're still the remaining oysters that are in the bay, and they throw out their babies, and they're babies that can swim and they can find their way to the smells of shell, and then they need hardscapes to grab onto. And so our effort here is to try to build into this restoration a new kind of organism restoration that anticipates a lot of the work that's coming in the future. And this story was recently in the Bay Area section of the Chronicle last week, and tells a little bit about the efforts that we are trying to undertake in this project. There's John Young, who's leading that effort up, and some of those floating 3D printed panels as he's pulling them out of the water to look at them. And we all have seen the incredible changes that Crissy Field is bringing, and recognize that even within a small urban landscape, that we can bring abundance of life back, and that we can re-spirit a place through bringing nature into that place. And we can educate kids and bring kids out to monitor and observe. And this is what we need to do all over the place. What we're trying to do here, we can do everywhere. And I think we recognize that we have to do that in order to preserve biodiversity and to build back the ecosystem services that have been lost from years of the work that has happened in urban landscapes. So while the wild in the city that used to be, from the dunes to the salt marshes to the lakes and freshwater seeps to oak woodlands, we're not going back to the old San Francisco, but where we can integrate these places into the interstitial spaces of the city and bring back wild things and bring back the spirit of nature where we live. And that's it.
Thanks, Lou. It's such an amazing, inspiring project. And we do have a couple of really interesting questions, but I thought I'd start just following up on what you're saying. We have a question from Brian Schmidt, and something I've been thinking about too, about did you reintroduce any animal or insect species? And I know that you have done a little bit of that. So why don't you tell us about some of the, so this is not just plants, what are some of the animals you brought back?
Great. Yeah, so we've actually done quite a lot of reintroducing lost plant species, but in the last 10 years or so, we have done an enormous amount, and this is under the leadership of John Young, who's our wildlife ecologist, and David Harrelson. And they have done just some of the most innovative work that I'm just so proud to work with those guys. Here in the Tennessee Hollow watershed, we were working with a partner that we work with, Stu Weiss, who runs Creekside Science, and we've been partnering with Stu for years doing different research projects. And Stu said to us years ago, there's a butterfly that would be so easy to bring back. You have brought all of the habitat back. Consider the Chalcedon checker spot, or the variable checker spot butterfly. It would be easy for you to do. And if you don't know the story of a lot of these butterflies, many of them have a particular host plant that they need for their larvae that they lay their eggs on, and then their larvae feed on, and they only feed on those particular species. And for the variable checker spot, which is pretty much lost from San Francisco and is otherwise a relatively common butterfly, it was an effort to identify all the habitat that we could with its host plant, which we have lots of, bee plant, and also sticky monkey, if you're familiar with that. And then we went to San Bruno Mountain and collected basically the caterpillars. And they are a butterfly that's relatively easy because they aggregate in massive clumps. So you can go down and you can take a few and you can bring them back. And within a period of 3 years, we kept getting them, and we kept bringing them back with permits we got from the state of California to do this. It's probably one of our most abundant species now in San Francisco. If you come to the Presidio in March, you will see swarms of these butterflies all over the place. and they just couldn't get back here. They couldn't cross the city in order to get back here. They're not strong enough flyers, and there's not enough connective tissue. So one of the things that we're realizing is that that is probably the case for a lot of the species that could probably live here that won't have the opportunity to get back. So if you hear, conversations about what we need to do for climate change, you'll hear the concept of assisted migration. And so we're really practicing that now in anticipation. We're going to have to move things around in order for them to survive because they can't get here. The oysters is another example. They're going to come on their own if possible. And another extraordinary example of what we've been able to achieve, this is kind of breaking news in a way. At Mountain Lake, there is an imperiled species of freshwater mussel. Freshwater mussels, if you don't know, are some of the most critically endangered things in all of North America, and they don't get a lot of attention. But they're very important to ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems. The California floater mussel used to live in Mountain Lake in the Presidio and was lost for a variety of reasons. And now, as over the last 10 years, our staff with John Young leading the efforts have gone out searching for the last remnants in California of these species, bringing them back and repopulating them. And it's been a lot harder than we expected. And just last week, we discovered in Mountain Lake, as those guys went down and found probably 100,000 of them that are now in the lake, which really was hard to do. And the story of their life cycle and how to bring them back is pretty amazing. And hopefully, Eric, maybe there's a story for you from Bay Nature.
It's nice with insects and gastropods when you can go from 0 to 100,000 real quick.
Exactly.
We had a couple of good questions. Frederick Leist and Ana Gazo asked about the Wilson's warbler in the slide. It looked like that one increased and then decreased. Can you tell us quickly what happened there?
Yeah, we're not sure. In the way we monitor, as a lot of bird populations in California are monitored, you get a snapshot, a couple days from the winter and the spring when they come out and they do their area searches to determine what's there. So it was just possible that the day that they came out, and I want to point out that data was between 20, I think it was over a period of about 10 years. And that was the last we measured that was in 2015. And we've since measured that, and those have come back. So there's a chance that we just had the timing was not right to see them the days that we were out there. That's what we anticipate with that specific data, but they are now abundant at that site as well.
Got a couple questions I think are really interesting. George Nesbitt, Brian Schmidt asked about this as well, and I'm going to combine them. Aaron Choate asked, how did you deal with soil to make this plantable? You had to sort of excavate, so what happened to the stuff you took out? And then did you have to add anything back in to make this plantable?
So in every project we do, whether it's a sand dune or a grassland or an oak woodland or the salt marsh at Quartermaster Reach, soil is one of the first things that I think about is how do we get the soil right? Because if you don't have it right, it won't work. And all of that human fill that was placed on top of the soil had to be removed in order for it to function the way we wanted it to. And it's also the case that fill needed to be removed in order to get back to the hydrology that we needed for the Quartermaster Reach system to work. So by scraping it down, we got back to that pre-soil, and some of it's not exact. We have mix of fill that's still there, but it's good enough, and it's in a way that is not overly compacted, and it has the right constituents from chemistry to basically the physical properties that will support the plants that we're putting in there. So in every case, it's different, and in the sand dunes, it's a very different system, where we've learned that in order to do it right, sand dunes, when they have eucalyptus or Monterey cypress, become hydrophobic, meaning they repel water. Every sand particle gets coated in these oils that repel water. And that doesn't work when you're trying to restore a sand dune and all the abundance of native plants we do. So we developed a technique where we basically dug holes and pushed all the surface material on and excavated soil out and spread it over. And it solved two functions. It got rid of all those weeds that we didn't want, and it made it less hydrophobic. And whenever we do that, like we recently did just down the street here in some dunes, we have incredible success with all of these rare and endangered plants that we're trying to restore. So soil is essential, and it's very particular to every site and the kind of habitat that you're looking to do.
I love this question from Jocelyn Combs too. Is there enough natural water from the springs to sort of flush out the reach, or did you add any water?
Great question. So a lot of these former wetlands of San Francisco were seasonal, and that's still the case. The springs are perennial. They do trickle all year round, but not always as in the volumes that they do during the rain season. So in the rain season, you'll see these reaches full of water when it's raining, and they flow really fast. But right now, they're pretty much dry. You can go down there and you can scratch your finger at the surface and the soil's wet, but the flowing water's gone. So they are seasonal wetlands. And no, we don't add any additional water to them. That's just the kind of habitat that they are.
We got time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. One we've got from a couple of people is just about where are you guys with COVID restrictions? And I think that blends into as well, like if people want to get involved, is there a way to get involved now? What do you anticipate in the future?
Yeah, we are so eager to get back our volunteer community. It is one of the things that because like I said, this work is not the same when you don't have the people that we have built to help us along with this. And it really has been a hit for us, not only just for the spirit of our community, but for the work that we are able to get done. And so we here in the Presidio, as well as in the greater Golden Gate National Recreation Area, are working through protocols to bring back volunteers as soon as we can. And as the city of San Francisco kind of eases its restrictions generally, we're hoping to have people back soon to help us. We won't be back in the way that we were last year this time, when we have 100 people out eating burritos together and getting dirty in the ground. But we will enable it to have individuals who've been working with us for years to help us in the interim. And that's good for everybody right now, to have their hands in the ground and participating in this. We want to bring that back, but we just have to go through all the safety protocols to make sure that we can do that right.
Let's maybe end with sort of a combined question. Anna Els asked about this. Arlene Gamil asked about the shoreline and what sort of habitat do you get where the freshwater mixes with the saltwater? And then what happens as the sea level rises?
So in that mixing zone, the brackish marsh, the brackish habitats that extend from, Abbott's Lagoon or to Tomales Bay, these are the areas where the salt and the fresh mix. And those are known to be some of the most productive habitats on Earth and biologically diverse. So we do have a little of that here in this project, and we are sculpting those areas where we know that's going to be the case to have those particular species that are very specifically oriented to that brackish habitat be there. Some of them are rare plants that we're bringing back as well. So that is, in the scheme of things, in the amount of wetlands that have been lost, we have a very small portion of brackish habitat, but we do have some, and we're working to bring the plant life back for those. Sea level rise is, we know it's going up, and it's probably going faster than we all think. And so, we might be back at this in 50 years or 100 years. A lot of energy goes in, and we try to consider these sea level rise scenarios, but that's on us to figure out how fast that curve is. And if we're going to have to come back and shore it all up at some other time, whether it's by importing a bunch of sand to create sand dunes like they're considering doing up at Stinson Beach, or, you know, re-engineering it. And so we just spent billions of dollars in this area, and let's hope that we aren't going to accelerate to the degree that renders that another billion-dollar project in the years ahead. We don't think so, and it was designed with that in mind, with some of those scenarios, but it's hard to say.
All right, well, we're 1 minute over, so I want to just thank you very much, Lou, for taking the time, for showing us all the pictures and the before and after, and just telling us what an inspirational project. And you know, I hope to see more of these in the years to come. Thank you, everyone else, for coming and listening to us tonight. You know, follow us, Presidio Trust. It's presidio.gov, and at baynature, baynature.org. Thanks again, Lou.
Thanks so much.
All right, take care, everybody.